Oh, okay, wonderful. Well, welcome everyone, the attendees. I can't see you guys, but I just assume you're out there. And it is going to be a great talk. Our planning talk had me really excited. I'm honored to be able to moderate this session. So as the moderator, I'm not the expert, but to keep us on time and to facilitate the discussion and conversations in between. So our panelists today, we have Dr. Laura Lee. She's the founder of Breakthrough Genomics. It's a pioneer in leveraging machine learning for the analysis of genomic data, the whole genome sequence. It's fantastic that we're able to do this. This is why I love technology, especially doing it in my area of pediatrics is wonderful. We have Dr. Aditya Khosla, recently completed his PhD in machine learning and computer vision at MIT, did a master's degree at Stanford, and also graduated from Caltech. And he developed new methods and applications in computer vision, eye tracking, imaging, and deep networks. We had Dr. Ron Lee. I'm not sure, I can't see him at the moment. He might be having to rejoin. But we have Dr. Anant Madabhushi, who's a professor of biomedical engineering at Case Western University in Cleveland, director of the University of Computational Imaging and Personalized Diagnostics. And his research interests are quantitative imaging, diagnostics, cancer imaging as well. So today's session, we're going to talk about AI in healthcare, which I think is a huge topic. The scope is really large. So we'll try to take a few deeper dives into some certain areas, but it covers sort of the whole healthcare industry, from clinical care and engineering and even the finances and the healthcare system as well. So we'll have to narrow the scope a bit. Hi, Dr. Lee, nice to see you again. We've got Dr. Ron Lee, who's a clinical assistant professor of medicine from the Division of Hospital Medicine and the Center of Biomedical Informatics at Stanford University. He is also the Medical Informatics Director for Artificial Intelligence and Clinical Integration at Stanford Healthcare. So let's begin sort of to set the tone of what we think our definition is of AI. When I think of AI, I think of the ability for science to work together with humans and machines and depict or mimic natural functions and brain functions that we do, learning and speech, problem solving, vision, knowledge generations. But with AI, you need tons of data to be able to have these predictions and to make them correct. If you're collecting not wrong data, then you're building the wrong research model. So I'd love to hear all of your definitions on AI. Aditya, how about we start with you?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. So, the field of AI is definitely fairly broad and encompasses, a lot of many different areas, like robotics, vision, speech, and so on. But I think in the most abstract sense, and probably how I perceive of when people refer to AI and what works these days is pattern recognition. Right. I think we're able to recognize complex patterns from data, and that's sort of my, it's like I think when you talk about the actual definition, it's broader, but that's usually what people are referring to these days when we talk about the field of AI. And specifically like machine learning and deep learning within that are sort of the areas of focus for a lot of people in the field these days.
Well, I see Dr. Ron Lee nodding, so maybe we'll go next. Your definition of AI. Oh, we can't hear you. No, we can't hear you. Anant, did you want to go next while he's working on the...
Sure. Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, sure. I agree with what Aditya said. I think that, I guess I would say that today when we think about artificial intelligence, we usually conflate one category of machine learning, mostly deep learning and deep neural networks, as sort of constituting AI. In our group, I will say that we've actually taken what Aditya called the pattern recognition approach. So But a lot of the problems that we're working on in the medicine space, a lot of my work, a lot of the work in our center focuses on using artificial intelligence for addressing problems in precision medicine. And a lot of the data that we work with is mostly medical imaging data, pathology, MRI scans, CAT scans. And the sort of almost one would call the classical approach now is to take a lot of data provided to one of these neural networks and have the neural networks learn or do what is called unsupervised feature generation, where the network tries to learn the best representations to distinguish category A from category B. We've taken a slightly different approach where we said, yes, it is about representation, but rather than letting the network go in and learn the representations by itself to distinguish the categories of interest, we've taken the approach that let's try to understand and identify and define what are the patterns that make sense, what are the patterns that resonate with the particular problem that we're trying to solve, what are critical for the domain that we're interested in or that we're working on. So I guess I would say that, there is the category of the deep neural networks that represents the more data-hungry kind of approach, where you need a lot of data from the machine to, in an unsupervised way, learn patterns. But the other way, where you're sort of defining patterns a priori, and then go in and look for those specific patterns, or what you could almost call, computational imaging biomarkers. The nice thing about that approach is that it actually reduces the need and the overhead for having copious amounts of data. So because you know in advance the particular kind of pattern or the particular motif that you're looking for in the data, you can actually get away with having a smaller amount of data. So that's sort of the way I think of AI, the unsupervised feature generation with the neural network, and then sort of the more domain-inspired, targeted pattern recognition approach.
Yes, and I think clinicians need to be able to understand you as an engineer as well when you're working with them, what you just said. Dr. Lee, do we... So Laura, would you like to go next on your definition of AI?
Sure. I think Aditya and Anant already give a very good definition of AI, and I have a disclaimer to say. I'm like a board certified in genetics, and I'm not a computer person. So, but I see AI as like a so we're working with the genetic data and genomic data, and there are a lot of patterns that need to be discovered. And so right now, with the explosion of the data and with the super efficiency of the computer power, and we actually can apply the AI to a lot of area. And I think in healthcare is a very good a field to apply the AI, because the in healthcare there's there are a lot of work is repetitive, and there are a lot of patterns that really easy to be recognized. And so using AI and try to help the healthcare workers to increase the efficiency and really provide like a lot of and a wonderful service for the patients. In fact, that's a really good usage. And I would see AI right now is really in the prime time to be applied in the healthcare.
Yeah, prime time. I think pre-COVID and even more, spotlight showcase right in the center during COVID as well. We'll check in one more time with Ron to see if he's on. You can hear him? Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. I promise I am somewhat tech literate. It just so happened that everything happened at the same time, so I really appreciate your patience. So let me know if the audio is poor. There might be some background noise. Okay, well, just to follow up on your question earlier, how do you define AI? So I think everyone did a great job defining machine learning and the models that we can build now with data to represent relationships between data and outcomes. I'm just going to take it once. Is my audio quality out good? Well, anyway, let me just continue. So one thing I'd like to add here is to think about AI-enabled systems. So now that we have models, machine learning models that can predict and classify, how do we actually build systems and products that can be enabled by machine learning? And I think about AI as the actual overall product that the end user will end up using, which includes the machine learning model, but it may also include the human-computer interface, the workflows, basically a set of structures and patterns that are enabled by prediction tasks that ultimately can be more intelligent than what we have now. Apologies for the audio if there are any issues.
Yeah, if you have headphones, I think with a mic, that might be helpful. But today's session is not about IT; it's about AI. So why don't we talk a little bit about the data? AI needs loads of data to be able to build these intelligent systems. That's what makes AI so powerful. So how do you guys build a robust data estate? How do you manage the data? And what does your data sets look like? And Anant, I'll head to you first.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for that question, Nadine. So I think that, I get asked this question quite a bit. How much data do you need? And sort of the underlying assumption seems to be that you need a lot of data. I'm going to stir the pot a little bit and be a little contrarian here and say that it's not necessarily about a lot of data. It's actually about a plurality of data, right? So it's not that you need, having a million scans or a million data points from a single institution, in my mind, is less valuable than having maybe a few hundred data points from multiple different institutions, right? And so I really think it's about learning the plurality and the diversity of the data from as many different sources, as many different sites as possible. And it's also important to understand why, right? So, in medical imaging, which is where I spend most of my time, we know that medical imaging data tends to vary as a function of the acquisition device. If you're working with MRI scans, or working with CAT scans, or working with pathology images, the particular scanner that you're getting your scans from can imbue certain attributes into the data, which might make it not possible for the AI to generalize the data from another scanner. So for instance, if you train your data sets or your AI on data sets from a single scanner, you then move to a G scanner, it might not work. So I believe that it's not about having just a lot of data, it's about the plurality of data. Really having the AI exposed to as many possible sources of variance as we possibly can. The other piece, I think, is also it's very highly contingent on the particular kind of problem that you're trying to solve. There are certain problems where I would contend that you may not need a huge amount of data because the problem perhaps is relatively straightforward, or it's not as challenging. So I think that one of the things that we've shown in our work is that the amount of data that the AI needs is directly proportional to the difficulty of the problem that you're trying to address. It's a much more difficult problem, and it's a given that you probably need a lot more data versus solving a simpler problem. So I just to come back to the original question or the original assumption, I actually don't know if it's having just a lot of data is really the critical piece. I think it's a plurality of data, and of course it goes without saying that it's also the quality of the data that's going to be important, right? So having really well manicured, well curated data that goes into the AI is probably an even more important prerequisite than just having boatloads of data.
All right, well, just to continue on that, can you all hear me now? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Well, just to continue what Anant had said earlier, so I agree that it's not just the amount of data, although I think in general, we have learned that size does matter in terms of the size of the data set, training accurate models. But I think when I think back to the actual AI-enabled product, what can we actually build that will be useful to the end user? Often having the most accurate machine learning model possible, as classically measured, often isn't enough, or often may not even be what you want. I mean, what you want is a functioning product that works at runtime, that is able to use the data that is actually available when you're running the model. So if I'm deploying something some app in the hospital that is able to predict, who needs to go to the ICU. You could have an amazing model that's a neural net that's trained on all sorts of features, but if the data for those features isn't actually available at the time when you need to make the prediction, then the product won't actually be useful. So I think that's another consideration we have to make when we think about training the machine learning model in the first place.
Yes. Dr. Lee? Laura?
Oh, okay. So I actually agree all of you, and in my field, in genomics, in genetics, there are lots of genomic data, and so to train the model, we not only need the genomic data, and we also very important to have the clinical information and go hand in hand, and also the data, when we train the model, we really have to make sure that so what the goal will be, and it's really clear, and then we clean the data and try to make sure that the data going into the model is a clean data. So also we have a true set of the data. And so we can test so to behave like a ground truth, to be used as a ground truth, and so we can see our model evolve. Whenever we change something, we try to improve it, and it's getting closer to the ground truth. And I think it is really important that you have the ground truth for something, and then you can measure and you're improving. And I think it's really important that we can find tons of data, but a lot of the data, before we use them, we have to do the cleaning, and otherwise it's impossible to have the correct model to be generated.
Agree, definitely, to clean and curate the data and make sure
Yes.
that the data is meaningful as well.
Yes.
Aditya?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to answer, your first part of the question, which was, how do you get data? I think, and I'm guessing it's shared with all of us here, is, working with the academic medical centers. You can work with labs. You can work with, pharmaceutical companies. So there's a lot of data that's out there, and I totally agree with what everyone is saying about, it's a lot about the quality. It's about having the right data, right? So it's not just about having more data, but having clean data. And I think that becomes even more important in healthcare, where there are just, so many confounders, because different patients can have just so many different trajectories, such that if you are not able to isolate the signal that, you're looking for, it becomes almost impossible to find it, right? Because the confounders are so many, even if you have an explosive amount of data, the algorithms will have a really hard time figuring out what's important. And I think one of the other areas that may not have been touched on is, you might be able to get a lot of data, but a lot of times, the machine learning approaches that work well are supervised approaches, right? Like these days, those are the primary way to go. So you need a way not just to collect, large data sets, but to be able to annotate them effectively. So how can you scale up the process of annotation such that you convert all of that almost like unstructured data that cannot be fed into the machine to structured data, right? And there are many companies that have done a fantastic job of, for example, taking EMR data, which is like very unstructured, very difficult. It's a whole lot of data, but how are you going to train anything on it because it's not structured, right? So I think a big part and big skill goes into converting all of this unstructured into structured data, so that you can then feed it into your algorithms to get the performance that you want.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of physicians, that's a pain point for them, is not being able to pull the right data from the EHR. And data has bias as well, similar to humans, and these biases do impact patient care. The way we collect data are built on systems that aren't always equal. I'd like to hear from you guys. How do you manage the challenges of bias? What implications does this have on the AI products that you're building as entrepreneurs, but also in academic centers? Aditya, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to go first. So, this problem of bias is definitely a very important one, and we've definitely seen failures of not accounting for these biases in the community, and it is bad, right? So essentially, we definitely need to deal with biases and potential, and I think the type of biases that might exist in in healthcare might be slightly different than the ones we might have seen in in the media and such. So for example, if you are building models for, say, a certain, staging a certain type of disease, you would want to make sure that you have data that is, diversified across all the different stages of disease, and you're not just capturing data from the high stages such that, your model is biased to predict just that. Similar to, what Anant said earlier, which is, you might want, you need data coming from multiple different labs and sources so that, the models you build actually generalize to those type of data, right? So you might be able to say, okay, I'll just take one lab and I can generalize super well, but it doesn't work outside. So making sure that you're accounting for all of these different confounding factors is essential, so your model is not, biased towards just one lab, or just predicting that, oh, somebody has high disease or low disease, essentially. So you want to capture that, capture it holistically.
Yes, and I know you work in this space a lot, and you also train other engineers, and as a professor as well. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on bias and AI.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for that question, Nadine. You really agree with what Aditya said there. I think it makes a very important point. I talked about this point earlier about the plurality of sources from which you acquire your data, and one of the problems that we've been working on quite actively in our group has been looking at the role of artificial intelligence, particularly for addressing problems in health disparity. And I guess this is extremely sort of almost even more important and critical for us to be thinking about these issues in this current sort of climate, if you will, of the need for social justice and racial equality. And one of the problems that we've been looking at has been trying to understand, are there differences in the appearance of disease across different populations? And the reason why we started to look at this was because my group has been working in the area of prostate cancer for several years and developing artificial intelligence algorithms to look at imaging data to try to figure out whether somebody has prostate cancer, and also to figure out what is the aggressiveness of prostate cancer. Now, for instance, in the US, we know that African American men with prostate cancer tend to have more aggressive disease compared to Caucasian American men. And in a study that we published actually just a few months ago, earlier this year, we actually showed in almost 350 men, some of whom were African American and others were Caucasian American, that the AI was able to identify differences in the appearance of the disease at a cellular level between black men with prostate cancer and white men with prostate cancer. And why is this important? This is really critically important, because identifying these differences means that we need to create dedicated population-specific risk models, because the sort of one-size-fits-all doesn't really work well in populations that are not represented in the training sets, right? So it goes back to what we were talking about, the diversity of the training data sets that you have. And what it turns out is that a lot of the risk calculators we currently have for stratification of aggressiveness of prostate cancer, those risk calculators were actually created without having appropriate representations for underrepresented communities. I mean, there were a lot of Hispanic men, there were a lot of African American men that were represented in the construction of these models. So guess what? When you take those models and apply it to African American men to risk stratify their prostate cancer, well, it doesn't work that way. And so by unearthing the differences in the appearance of the disease between populations, we realized the importance of creating these population-specific models. And we actually showed that when you create a dedicated model trained with data from African American men, that model actually worked extremely well in African American men, as compared to a model that didn't really account for those population-specific differences. So it's something that we've been very actively working on, and it actually goes to show that bias can actually creep in so many different ways. And to some extent, you actually have to go and part of it is serendipitous, that you identify some of these things by chance. But we have to be cognizant of all the time what are sort of the implicit biases that might be in the data, and then make their way into the models. And this is just as another quick example. We've just had an abstract accepted where we've demonstrated that there are differences in breast cancer between women in India, between South Asian women, and North American women. And so clearly there are differences across multiple populations. It's not just black men and white men. There are fundamental differences that might be too subtle for the naked eye to be able to discern from the imaging data. But the AI can play a huge role here because it can identify those more subtle differences and therefore pave the way to creating more population-specific models with the ultimate goal that you really help realize the promise of precision medicine, because you're now able to create more accurate prognostication or prediction of risk for different populations.
So I like to think about bias in two ways. I think it's important to think about the statistical bias that could come from a biased data set or a model that was trained perhaps suboptimally, right? So that's what we've been talking about. We have a biased machine learning model where we systematically make some mistake in terms of making some prediction. But I also want to think about bias in outcomes due to an AI product. So sometimes they're the same thing, but sometimes they're not. Because you have, for example, you could have a biased model that gives you some biased prediction. But when you actually create a product and you have a product that humans use that may deployed into a complex human work system, the complexity actually starts playing a role. So what ultimately happens to the patients once you deploy an AI model or AI-enabled product into some kind of work system with physicians, nurses, administrators, whoever, you'll start to see what I'd like to think of as emergent effects of what happens when you introduce this type of thing. So that may be the same effect as what we described in terms of you may, for example, systematically identify this group of patients versus not. But then if you actually have a bunch of people acting on those predictions and interacting with each other, then the outcomes that you actually see in real life may be actually much greater. I mean, the bias may be amplified, or maybe you won't have bias if you design the right structures to mitigate whatever statistical bias you may have. So again, I just think that there are just two ways of thinking of bias. Sometimes we conflate the two, but I think it's because we focus a lot on the statistical bias. We really need to think about the bias in the potential bias in outcomes once we actually have a product in real life used by human beings.
Laura?
Yes, so I totally agree. In genetics and genomics field, there are a lot of data that collected from Caucasian, and we don't have much data for African American, like South America and Asian people, and so we really use the existing data to train our model. We recognize that deficiency and that bias, and so I don't know our method will be can be generalized or not, but we actually create some feedback model, and so say if we do not recognize anything about African American or the data that we have never seen before, and so we can constantly learn this new knowledge, and to retrain our model, so to get our model improved as the more user using it, and then we will see that gradually, hopefully, the model will be generalized to the population that we start to see, and all we missed before.
And how can we leverage what we learn from this and sort of feed it back into the system, into maybe a new AI system that looks at different populations? And do you then again tweak the model as well? And I'll come back to you, Anant, for this question.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great question. One of the things about AI, we talk about the democratization of AI. It's going very quickly. I mean, it's been amazing how quickly this space has been evolving. That it's gone from maybe 4 years ago where standing up these AI models was primarily in the domain of highly technical computational engineers and highly technical data scientists. But now we're sort of seeing an explosion of models where you could, DIY it, right? I mean, you could essentially stand up these models by yourself pretty quickly. All you might have to do is identify your training data. But once you've done that, it actually is starting to become pretty trivial. I mean, there are whole companies and industries that are actually dedicated to helping democratize these AI models. And so what that actually opens up the opportunity to do is that as we talk about biases, as we talk about the variations of AI models to the kind of data that's fed into it, you could also start to find very quickly that you might have, say in a hospital, you could have multiple different scanners, and Ron could perhaps speak to this. You could have different scanners, you could have different CT scanners, you got maybe a Siemens, GE, Philips scanners right next to each other. All of them have slightly different acquisition parameters, and so the images might be slightly different from each other. And so rather than trying to fight this, trying to come up with a model that is generalizable across all of the three, it might be easier and more trivial, possibly, to stand up a dedicated AI model for scanner 1, scanner 2, scanner 3, right? And so I think that's actually what is really exciting with sort of the opening up and the democratization of these models. So if you've got the data and you've got the ability to stand up these models, then you don't really have to fight the fight of trying to create the universal AI model, a thing that's generalizable across all the scanners and all the sites and so on. You just start to stand up local sites. If you're using one scanner, the patient's going to go there, but you're going to specifically invoke the model that was trained for that particular scanner, that particular protocol.
And you made a great point that things are just moving very quickly, and AI can process a lot of data very quickly. Aditya, I'll come to you in terms of you being an entrepreneur, and so every 6 months, how are you sort of handling all these challenges as well?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting, idea. If we can sort of like, retrain our models per device, but I also wonder, like it seems like in the commercial setting, it might actually be a little bit challenging to do that because, the issue is that, yes, you can retrain it, but how do you make sure it doesn't drift so far that it loses all of the good knowledge that you had built up earlier, right? So I think the interesting challenge there is you might have, say, a large data set that you're working with. You have trained a model, it works really well, you've validated it, and now you take it to a new place. How can you, like when you adjust it, how do you make sure you didn't adjust it so far out that it starts making mistakes on everything prior, right? And we face that challenge from time to time, and I think maybe an alternative approach that we tend to follow is essentially, which is probably very similar to how most of the products operate, which is, you try to have like sort of a validation set that, you can run at a new site and say, okay, this seems to be working over here with the slides that are, generated there. You validate and you go, and if it doesn't validate, then you maybe in the next iteration you might update your model to include slides from the labs where you couldn't validate correctly, right? Or if the lab really wants to use it, they may adjust their staining parameters or whatever we think might be the reason for the failure, so as to be able to validate this. But yeah, I think it would be very interesting to explore being able to adjust these things on the fly. I mean, I know certainly commercial applications that are consumer based certainly try and do this, but how to do this in healthcare with the FDA and all these things in the middle, I think that's going to make it very interesting and challenging.
Yeah, and when a human makes makes an error, it's sort of a one-on-one interaction. But in AI, the error can affect populations, and you need to sort of convince folks like Ron that this works and this is good for the hospital. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Thanks for those thoughts. I think that we talked about the so-called learning healthcare system for quite a bit, and I think that this is when it really becomes not just important but critical as we're thinking about how do we even use artificial intelligence in the health system. because the truth is that these models are very complex. So for example, in the past, if we've been using things like rules-based alerts for quite a bit to drive some of our care. The difference is that with those alerts, let's say there is a mistake, which I mean there are often mistakes that happen from these rules-based alerts. The mistakes are fairly predictable because maybe a guideline got updated. So we know that the rules that drove some alerting system before are no longer correct. So we kind of know that because we know the guidelines have got updated. I think with machine learning, the changes are a bit more unpredictable. They're a bit more complex. Often you don't understand why those changes occurred. So they're also more dynamic because it's not like they change. We know they're going to change every 6 months when the consensus guidelines get updated. They change based on the data that's going in, based on how the model is behaving. So it becomes almost more important. It becomes very important to actually monitor not just how the model is performing, but how is the work system behaving, the work system that is enabled by the model. So we have a model right now that's predicting which patients need to go to the ICU in the next 6 to 18 hours. So not only do we actually have to monitor for model drift, which is simply how accurately is this model predicting that particular outcome, we need to be monitoring what are the nurses and physicians doing when they're exposed to the model, what orders are they putting in, how is their behavior changing? And these are things that we can monitor to an extent, even visually, as we have the electronic health record. Because that goes back to my earlier point, which is we have to look at not just the machine learning model behavior and the bias associated, but we have to look at the work system, the product, and how the outcomes actually change. And often they may not be the same. And the latter, the changes in outcomes, the bias in outcomes, I see that as very much an emergent property of a very complex system. And you only measure that by actually seeing it in practice rather than trying to predict it in any way.
Yes. Laura, we'd love to hear from you in terms of your workflow and increasing the amount of data as you move forward.
Yeah. Okay. So we have we have some product, and so basically this product that the users are going to use this to analyze the genomic data and try to do the diagnosis. So we collect the data through that, through user submission of the data, and then we collect the data. And often these users, they are very trained people and have the credential to make the diagnosis. So that's why we can collect the user data and make sense to use that data and just saying those data are labeled data, and so we're able to and it has the certain quality, and so we can feel that can improve our model, and so yeah. So that's how we collect the data and how we use the data for the machine learning.
Aditya, you brought up the regulatory challenges as well, and so sometimes I feel like there's a bit of a balancing act that everyone has to do in terms of managing the clinical piece, the engineering piece, the regulatory piece. So we'd love to hear from you about the workflow and what is your balancing act that you need to balance?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I mean it's always a interesting balancing act because there's a lot of basically the regulations exist to protect people, right? And I think it is a great it is a good thing for people at large, right? And someone coming from a company where we all want to innovate and move things forward, it can feel like something that is slowing you down, right? But honestly, it is for good reason, right? Like once you understand and explore why these regulations exist, you're like, okay, we want to make sure that we don't accidentally hurt someone, and so the interesting challenge is how can you while having these type of constraints, how can you work effectively and build the best technology, right? And I think one of the big challenges that the community is currently thinking about is, we know that the systems we build are most certainly not going to be perfect, right? Like there's going to be errors, and there's a great opportunity for us to actually learn from the mistakes we're making, right? And if you look at any of the, like consumer applications that are not healthcare related. They're constantly learning, they're getting better. You're like, literally shipping a new model probably every day. While I think that process will probably be a lot slower in the healthcare side because of, all the regulations that are in place. And, you want to make sure that when you're attempting to fix something, you don't break something else, right? And you start hurting people in a different way. And so it is sort of that, interesting balance of how can you scale up to, meet the demand of, say, our field, like the area that we work in is in pathology, and it is a highly fragmented area, right? Like each of our organs looks different under a microscope, which means that we, either need to build some supermodel, which is probably pretty difficult, or build models for each of these different areas. And now then each of these areas need to undergo the regulatory process. So can you find a way to make that whole thing more scalable and repeatable so you can, start helping as many people as quickly as possible? So it's those are just some of the questions that we think about, and many more. We can talk about this for a long time. Yeah.
Ron, what's your balancing act that you've got with your patients and their families and the hospital as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with healthcare, we obviously have very high standards, and it is difficult. I think people are very risk averse in healthcare, which I think is a good thing in general, because in general, on average, if you introduce something new, it'll perturb the existing system, and often change is viewed as something that could be dangerous. So I think that's just something that we'll have to deal with in healthcare. But I agree with Aditya that you don't want to necessarily use that as something that will stifle innovation. I mean, my perspective is that we have to think about what exactly are we regulating when we talk about regulating AI. So are we regulating the machine learning model? Are we regulating the software that the model is driving? Are we regulating the human-computer interface that, maybe the alerting system, for example? I think there are all these different components that ultimately will go into the final product that's going to be used by a patient or clinician. So I think when we say regulate AI, we probably usually mean regulate the model, which I think is important. But we have to think about the other stacks, the other layers of an AI product. We regulate the entire product as a new thing. Is there going to be a new framework for that, or can we actually regulate the individual components? And can we actually think about it in a somewhat modular way, where we can say, hey, this method of delivering some kind of AI prediction tends to work well, like this type of alerting system. Maybe we need to actually switch out a new model that's more accurate, less biased, but it doesn't mean that we have to just start from scratch. So just something to think about there.
Excellent. Yes, definitely so much in there that we could unpack as well. Laura, what's sort of your balancing act with this regulatory piece?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the healthcare, is really important that we apply the AI in healthcare, and we want to increase the efficiency, try to see the pattern, and help the healthcare system to be more efficient and more affordable. And but at the end result, it should help the patients, not to hurt the patients. So I'm totally for that, and I think for us, we have the responsibility to make sure that our model or our application, our product will not hurt people. And so like with that being said, and what we can do is we try to make our product, our model, as accurate as possible. And when you think about the imaging applied in the healthcare and to read the X-ray, so in the end, although we have the AI method to be applied, and in the end, always the human has to make the final judgment and say, okay, so this is the positive case. I agree. And so I in terms of in our field, we do the diagnosis, and I think we have a threshold, and we set the threshold is very conservative, and so if it passes the threshold, we are 100% sure it's correct. But we always have the cases, a certain percentage of the cases, we're not quite sure. And so we have to have the human come in to make the final decision to avoid any mistake happen. And so that's what we do right now.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have folks like yourself working as well in the healthcare space, because all of you mentioned the why that you're doing this is to help people, to help engineers, to help the clinicians, to help the patients. And I know Anant is sitting on a mountain of data, probably in front of him, and images from all across different countries as well. So, what's your sort of balancing act, even with moving this amount of data around as well?
Well, let me try to take the former question first with the regulatory piece, which I think is a really important one. And I think that's it's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And interestingly, I've actually been working with the FDA on thinking about how to, well, actually connects the two questions that you asked me. One is about data and then the regulatory piece. So this probably won't come as a surprise to a lot of people, but the FDA is also trying to figure things out, right? So they don't actually know. They don't have a rubric of rules where you send in an application, they know exactly, what to do with it, right? Is this a PMA? Is it a 510K? The rules are still evolving, right, for the regulation of a lot of AI. And one of the projects that I'm involved, myself and a few other folks who work in the computational pathology space, are actually working with the FDA to advise them, but also to stand up data sets. Right? You talked about the importance of the data. Well, one of the critical things that the FDA is trying to do is to stand up well-curated, well-annotated data sets, which can then serve as the basis for testing and validation of the algorithm. So you've got an AI algorithm for segmenting cells or identifying cells with cancer on pathology images. Well, the FDA has decided that they want to create their own in-house gold standard data trust that will then be used to validate algorithms that are coming in. So I just want to just put that out there that it's not, when we talk about the regulatory piece, it's evolving, it's fluid, because it's not like the rules exist. They are still being pondered on, they're still being written out. So that's one piece that I want to put out there. The other interesting piece is that when you talk about the regulatory piece, it's we sort of just assume that all of these AI algorithms will have to go to the FDA to be approved, and that might well be the case. But it's also worth considering that some of the tools that are out there, which may not fall within the AI rubric, but use some sort of rule-based decision. As an example, without naming names here, now I'll just say that a very popular genomics-based test or gene expression-based test for breast cancer, right, which is in the NCCN guidelines, reimbursed by CMS and Medicare, actually is not FDA approved, but it's actually used. And they've found a way to sort of circumvent the regulatory piece and the regulatory strategy, and have been in commercial deployment for maybe 2 decades. So one of the other things that I question is, is every AI tool or every AI algorithm necessarily going to be FDA regulated going forward? It may well be the case, but I just want to point out that it may not sort of always be such. And then finally, the third point that I just want to put out there is that I think from the FDA standpoint, back to what Aditya said, I think the goal is, of course, that you want to protect patients, right? And you want to make sure that whatever tools that we're developing, that we're not making some grand claims which would result in adverse impact or effect on the patient. But I also see it as a way to challenge us as scientists, as researchers, to make sure that we do our due diligence, right? At the end of the day, when you talk about sort of the liability or the risk, and the reason why this has to be regulated is because fundamentally, what the regulation is saying, look, you've got to go and figure out and convince us that your algorithms are safe, they are generalizable, that they are not going to say that somebody does not have cancer when they actually do have cancer. So in a very real sense, it's almost challenging us to be the best we can possibly be with our AI algorithms, with our AI approaches. And I don't actually see that as a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. right? I mean, you've got to, you want to move this into the clinic, you want to deploy this, you want to have pathologists use it or radiologists use it, then you got to be the best you can possibly be, and you got to make sure that your algorithm is at that 99% AUC or whatever it is. So yes, it is a balancing act, but at the same time, I think it's a way for us to be cognizant of the real world challenges, the real world issues. It's not sufficient that you've got something that runs in the lab. Once you bring it to the real world, it doesn't work. And we've seen so many examples. And perhaps one of the most spectacular examples recently was Google's AI algorithm in ophthalmology, where they have some amazing data that they put out and published in Nature and published in JAMA and so on. And then when they started to do field testing out in Southeast Asia, well, the algorithm didn't work. Right? And so that's a classic example of where you really need to make sure that these algorithms go through regulatory approval, that they pass the litmus test to be able to really withstand challenges that they're likely to encounter in the real world deployment setting.
Wonderful. So maybe we have a few minutes left. I'd love to just kind of do a loop around all of you and to hear about some of the research you're working on, and even if it's COVID related as well, and maybe one challenge that you're kind of working on or that you're in at the moment. And maybe Laura, we'll start with you.
Sure. So we actually were working in genomics because more and more people doing the whole genome sequencing, and so there's a terabytes of data to be analyzed for each sample. So we try to use AI to do the diagnostic, to do the diagnosis. And so while we're in the middle of this, and the COVID hit us, and so we spent some time to try to figure out in the human genome. So what are the markers in our genomes that can determine when the people are exposed to COVID, and why some people really have a no symptom or very little symptom, and why some people have very dramatic symptom and even pass away because of this virus. And so we actually right now we're collaborating with Genomics England, and so they have hundreds of thousands of whole genome data, and they have the COVID symptom phenotype, and so we're collaborating and try to use the machine learning to find out are there any markers that we can predict this we call the risk of susceptibility to COVID.
Yeah, they have a huge bank in London. We know about the UK bank as well. Aditya, any challenges that you're in right now, AI challenges and great research you're working on, and last thoughts?
Sure. I'm happy to just, I think AI challenges, I think these are similar to what everyone in the community faces, which is, how can we generalize models better with less data, right? And I think this is a holy grail for machine learning, and you can imagine how hard it would be to build models that don't have too much data, because it just does not exist in the world when you're trying to go after more and more, rare diagnoses. And I think one of the areas where we're trying to go after is essentially, instead of just trying to replicate what humans are doing right now, which is saying say cancer or not cancer. Can we actually, use pathology images to directly predict outcomes of patients, right? Conditioned on certain treatments. And if you can do that, that is I guess I call it a win-win-win, which is it's a win for patients because they have a higher probability of being alive. It's a win for pharmaceutical companies because you can help make their drugs more effective by identifying the right patient populations. And it's a win for us because we get to work on cool stuff and save lives at the same time. So I will close with that and pass it off to the next speaker.
Wonderful. Anant?
Yeah, thanks. So with regard to COVID, our lab We went to the virtual format very soon after the shutters came down in early March. Thankfully, everybody in the group is safe, and we've continued to work remotely, as have many other groups and many other companies. One of the problems that we're working on is similar to what Laura talked about, where we're looking at using AI with CT scans of COVID-19 patients to try to identify as to which patients with COVID-19 will have more severe disease and probably go on to need a mechanical ventilator versus those patients who probably will not have as severe a manifestation of the disease and probably don't need to be admitted into the ICU. So that's one of the projects. We got some really compelling data that we just submitted for consideration for publication. Just some closing thoughts on sort of, what are the challenges and what are sort of the opportunities going forward. I think that there's an increasing realization that there is so much data associated with any individual patient, right? And so the way, unfortunately, that we tend to, the way medicine typically tends to work is that it's very siloed, right? I mean, you talk about radiology, you talk about pathology. There's a radiologist, there's a pathologist, there's a clinician, an oncologist. It's all very siloed. And one of the things that we've been looking at is the integration and the combination of multiple sources of data, right? So if you take most cancers today, for instance, you take breast cancer as an example. There's some sort of molecular profiling done. There's maybe GWAS, some sort of gene expression profiling, maybe proteomics. You probably have multiple different imaging scans done. There's biopsy, potentially a lumpectomy or mastectomy if the patient has cancer. So there's all these multiple different streams of data. And there's an appreciation that there's a very small sliver of that data that ultimately really gets interrogated. So even if you talk about pathology, we're just talking about the pathology aspect. But then there's all this information in the MRI scan, there's information in the 3D mammogram. So there's so much information that we're not really integrating and exploiting and utilizing. And so I think going forward for AI in medicine, I think the real rich opportunity is to try to break down the silos. How can we combine the plurality of data that we're routinely acquiring for so many different diseases and integrate that to provide the most comprehensive, most accurate possible assessment to what Aditya said is you want to prognosticate what is going to happen to the patient. And then more critically than just prognosis alone is you want to know what the treatment response is going to be. You want to be able to identify what the benefit of therapy is. And so how can we leverage all the diversity of the data, the radiographic, the pathology, the omics data, integrate that to come up with the best possible prognostic and predictive solution?
Yeah, one of my colleagues had mentioned this morning in his talk that also your health data, it comes from so many different sources and not always the hospital as well. And so I think that integration and interdisciplinary way of looking at the data matters as well. And Ron, some last thoughts from you, any COVID projects you're working on or other challenging AI projects?
Thanks, Nadine, and thanks again for having this panel. I mean, I think the fact that we can have multiple disciplines talking about this together, I think it's just a key component of making all this work, so thanks again. In regards to COVID, I think what COVID has done for the health systems in the US, it was a huge stress test. And you can argue it was a stress test for other aspects of society as well, but definitely for health systems, it stress tested our baseline chassis, if you will, our chassis for delivering care. And I think that it demonstrated it proved many of our suspicions that a lot of the things we have are just are outdated, they don't work well, they're inefficient, they're prone to error, all sorts of things, right? And when COVID first hit, starting around March, I mean, a lot of us were really anxious. I mean, we needed to change things very quickly because we were seeing that patients were dying, clinicians were dying, and we knew that what we had, the workflows, the systems of care delivery we had, it was not going to cut it. So that was actually a really interesting time. Everything was on the table, and we actually had a project trying to use a machine learning model to reorganize some of our ICU workflows such that we could better handle the predicted increase in capacity. Luckily, at least in the Bay Area, we didn't experience some of the really kind of horrendous situations that other parts of the world experience. But I think what it did demonstrate was that it's possible that the AI is what I see the value I see from AI is that it allowed us to rethink many of the systems of care delivery that we knew were inefficient but could be more efficient. So this is where I always go back to AI as not just being the machine learning model. The machine learning model is the critical component, it's the active ingredient, if you will. But what I'm most excited about is this product, this AI, what AI can enable, which is could be a software, it could be workflows, team structures actually, where I think we're seeing actually how physicians and nurses can communicate differently with each other. They have different roles that can be now defined because we could have models that present information to both of them at the same time, right? So democratize information and insights that previously was not possible before. So this is an example of how AI enables a new team structure that hopefully can make things more efficient and more effective. And that's also my closing thought, which is that I really encourage everyone to think about AI more broadly. Think about what your machine learning model, what your classification prediction task can enable in terms of what new systems can they enable. And then also please take into account the complexities of the human systems in which these models will take place. Because ultimately the effects, the outcomes that we'll experience once we have AI in our workflows, it's unpredictable. It's almost impossible to actually predict what's going to happen because by definition it's a complex system. We can't predict it, but we can see it. I think that's why we need to be very rigorous about monitoring, about prospectively evaluating things that are actually alive in the environment, an in vivo experiment, if you will, rather than just an in silico experiment about the models. And then only then can we actually see what actually happens and then use that to reinforce further innovation.
Agree, and that if there's any time in history for AI, for translational research, for engineering, for medicine to come together, this is the moment. So and I'm thrilled to hear all of you guys are working on this space. That's what we need, is really smart people working on these hard problems. So this was a wonderful opportunity for me to learn from you guys during our planning call in this. So thank you so much for participating today, and I know Anant, you're on the East Coast, so we very much appreciate that you're with us in the evening. And I wish you all a wonderful evening, and thanks so much. I'm sure the panelists will reach out to you after today, but thanks for working on these really tough problems that hopefully we can solve over the next few years, or at least find our, I don't want to say a new normal because nothing is ever really normal, but our new baseline maybe, or a way to toggle between all of these different parts and come out on top. So have a wonderful evening, everyone, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.